In the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where danger lurked behind every tree and survival depended on wit and resilience, one child's extraordinary journey defied all odds. This is the incredible true story of Sarah Mitchell, a 6-year-old girl who witnessed the brutal massacre of her family's wagon train, escaped death by playing dead among the bodies of her loved ones, and found an unlikely sanctuary with a pack of wolves who raised her as their own. For nearly 4 years, Sarah lived as a wolf child, adopting their ways and forgetting her human past, until fate brought her face to face with a lone hunter who would change her life forever. Join us as we uncover this remarkable tale of tragedy, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of a child who learned to thrive in the most extraordinary circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1872, and America was a nation still healing from the wounds of civil war while pushing westward with renewed vigor. The promise of fertile land and fresh beginnings drew thousands of families toward the territories of Montana and Wyoming. Among them were the Mitchells, Thomas and Mary, along with their 3 children, 10-year-old James, 6-year-old Sarah, and 3-year-old Emma. The Mitchells had sold their struggling farm in Pennsylvania after 2 consecutive years of poor harvests and mounting debts. Thomas, a skilled carpenter and former Union soldier, had heard stories of the lush valleys nestled between mountain ranges where a man could claim enough land to build a proper future for his family. Mary, though hesitant to leave behind her sisters and aging parents, eventually embraced her husband's vision of a better life in the West. They joined the Carson Reed wagon train, a collection of 12 families bound together by shared dreams and the practical necessity of safety in numbers. The journey began in early spring of 1872, with 47 souls setting out from Independence, Missouri. By midsummer, they had crossed the rolling plains of Nebraska and were making their way through the southeastern corner of Wyoming Territory. Following the North Platte River, Sarah Mitchell was an unusual child, quiet and observant where other children were boisterous and impulsive. She had her mother's emerald eyes and her father's sandy blonde hair, which she wore in 2 braids that bounced against her back as she walked alongside the wagon. Unlike her older brother James, who complained endlessly about the monotony of the journey, Sarah found wonder in the changing landscapes. She collected unusual rocks and feathers, pressed wildflowers between the pages of her mother's Bible, and spent hours watching the behaviors of prairie dogs and hawks. "That girl's got more wolf than child in her," joked Franklin Reed, the wagon master, whenever he caught Sarah crouched silently in the tall grass, studying a lizard or beetle with intense concentration. Little did he know how prophetic those casual words would prove to be. The Carson Reed party had been warned about increased tensions with the Blackfoot tribes whose territories they would skirt, but Thomas Mitchell had assured his wife that the presence of cavalry patrols in the region would keep them safe. What no one anticipated was the danger that would come not from native warriors, but from a band of desperate men who had been trailing the wagon train for 3 days. The Blackwell gang consisted of 7 outlaws, led by Josiah Blackwell, a former Confederate deserter who had turned to robbery and murder in the chaotic aftermath of the war. They had been responsible for 3 stagecoach robberies and the brutal raid on a small settlement near Fort Laramie earlier that month. Now, running low on supplies and aware that the Carson Reed party carried significant funds for establishing new homesteads, they had marked the wagon train as their next target. The attack came at dawn on July 27th. The wagons had formed their usual protective circle for the night, with 2 men standing watch. But in the grey light of early morning, when one guard went to wake his replacement and the other dozed at his post, Blackwell and his men struck with swift and terrible efficiency. Sarah was awakened by the first gunshots. Her father grabbed his rifle and ordered the family to stay down inside the wagon. Through a small tear in the canvas, Sarah watched in horror as Mr. Wilkins, one of the guards, fell with 3 bullets in his chest. Then came the screams, women and children crying out as the bandits moved from wagon to wagon, shooting any man who resisted and ransacking the family's possessions. Thomas Mitchell managed to fire twice, wounding one of the attackers before a bullet found his forehead. Mary clutched her children to her breast, whispering desperate prayers as heavy footsteps approached their wagon. When the canvas flap was torn aside, she lunged forward with Thomas's hunting knife, managing to slash at her attacker's face before she was shot point blank. James tried to shield his sisters, but was dragged from the wagon and beaten before being shot as well. In those terrible moments, 6-year-old Sarah's mind made a calculation that adults rarely could. She went completely limp, pulling her little sister down with her among their mother's skirts, both children smeared with their parents' blood. Emma, too young to understand, began to whimper, and Sarah pressed her small hand over her sister's mouth. But it was too late. The killer had heard, "Got some live ones here," a gruff voice called out. A rough hand grabbed Emma's ankle, yanking her away from Sarah's protective embrace. In a moment of pure instinct, Sarah kept her eyes closed and her body completely still, even as she heard her sister's final frightened cry cut abruptly short. The massacre claimed 39 lives that morning. Only the teenage son of the Cook family survived by hiding in a hollow beneath one of the wagons, and he would later give testimony that helped identify the Blackwell gang. But in the immediate aftermath, as the killers looted the wagons and finally rode away with their plunder, they believed they had left no witnesses. For hours, Sarah remained motionless among the dead. Shock had frozen her body and mind into a state beyond fear. When she finally opened her eyes, the sun was high overhead, and the buzzing of flies filled the air. With mechanical movements, she crawled out from beneath her mother's body and stumbled among the carnage, unable to cry, unable to fully comprehend the transformation of her world. She tried to wake her brother, shaking his shoulder as she had done countless mornings on their journey. When he didn't respond, something primitive in her brain finally understood that he never would again. She did the same with her sister and parents, then moved on to other familiar faces from the wagon train. None answered her touch. As the shock began to wear off, thirst drove her to the nearby creek where the horses had been watered. Most of the animals had been stolen or had fled during the attack, but one old mare remained, still tethered to a tree and trembling with fear. Sarah approached the animal, which calmed slightly at her familiar scent. She drank from the creek, then sat beside it, staring at her reflection in the water, a small girl with blood-matted hair and vacant eyes. The day waned, and as the sun began to set, a new fear took hold. Sarah had never been alone in the wilderness. She knew there were wolves, bears, and mountain lions in these lands. As darkness fell, the distant howl of a wolf pack sent her scrambling back to the wagons. She climbed into the family's wagon and burrowed beneath a quilt that still smelled of her mother, finally allowing herself to weep until exhaustion claimed her. Dawn brought the harsh reality of her situation into sharper focus. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She searched through the wagons, finding jerky and hardtack that the bandits had overlooked. She ate mechanically, then gathered more food into a small sack. Some deep instinct told her she couldn't stay here among the dead. Taking her father's canteen and a blanket, Sarah set out, following the creek downstream. She had overheard the adults discussing landmarks often enough to know that water would eventually lead to larger rivers and perhaps to settlements. What she didn't know was that the nearest outpost was more than 60 miles away, an impossible journey for a child her age to manage alone. For 3 days she walked, rationing her food carefully as her father had taught her. On the third night, weakened by exposure and approaching starvation, she collapsed beneath a large pine tree. The temperature dropped, and as she drifted between consciousness and delirium, she became aware of movement in the underbrush nearby. A pair of yellow eyes reflected the moonlight, then another and another. Wolves had found her. Sarah was too exhausted to feel fear. She watched through half-closed eyes as the alpha female approached cautiously, sniffing at the strange human pup. Perhaps it was the child's utter stillness, or the fact that Sarah carried no scent of fire or gunpowder that made the wolf decide she posed no threat. Whatever the reason, instead of attacking, the she-wolf settled beside Sarah, her warm body providing critical heat through the cold night. By morning, Sarah had been accepted, at least temporarily, by the pack. The alpha female, whom Sarah would later come to think of as Luna, seemed particularly interested in her. The wolf had recently lost most of her latest litter to a mountain lion attack, with only 2 pups surviving. Some ancient maternal instinct recognized another orphaned young one in need of protection. The wolfpack's territory spanned a secluded valley between 2 ridges centered around a series of caves in a rocky outcropping. It was to these caves that Sarah was brought, stumbling alongside her unlikely guardians. The 2 wolf pups, about 4 months old, were initially wary of the human child, but soon accepted her presence. In those first weeks, Sarah might have died despite the wolves' protection. She was weak from her ordeal and unfamiliar with the ways of survival in the wild, but children possess remarkable adaptability. She watched as the wolves hunted small prey, rabbits and ground squirrels, and learned to eat what they provided. When they brought down a deer, she used a sharp rock to cut portions for herself, instinctively avoiding the rotting meat that would have made her ill. Water came from a spring at the back of the main cave, ensuring she wouldn't suffer from thirst. For warmth at night, she huddled with the wolf pups and sometimes the alpha female, their body heat keeping the worst of the mountain chill at bay. Summer turned to fall, and with the changing seasons, Sarah changed too. Her clothes grew tattered and were eventually discarded. Her skin toughened against the elements, and she grew a covering of fine dirt that provided some protection from insects and sunburn. Her once neatly braided hair became a tangled mane that hung down her back. But the most profound transformation was internal. The trauma of the massacre had created a psychological schism in Sarah's young mind. As days turned to weeks and weeks, to months, her human past receded like a half-remembered dream. Language, that most human of attributes, began to fade from disuse. She no longer thought in words but in sensory impressions. Scents, sounds, the feeling of hunger or contentment. She began to communicate with the pack in their own way, through body posture, subtle vocalizations, and touch. She learned the pack hierarchy and her place within it. The alpha female treated her with a particular protectiveness that the other wolves respected. The pups, maturing quickly as wolf pups do, became her playmates and teachers, showing her how to stalk through the underbrush without making a sound, and how to catch fish in the shallow streams with quick, darting movements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By the time the first snow fell, Sarah had become something extraordinary, a human child living successfully as part of a wolf pack. She had learned to move on all fours when speed was required, though she still used her bipedal human gait when covering longer distances. Her vocal cords, once shaped for human speech, now produced credible approximations of wolf vocalizations: warning, barks, playful yips, and even the youngling's version of the howl that the pack used to communicate across distances. Winter brought new challenges. The cave provided shelter, but the cold was intense at the higher elevation. Food became scarce as many animals hibernate or migrate. The wolves grew leaner, and so did Sarah. There were hungry days when the pack failed to make a kill, and all of them curled together in the cave, conserving energy and warmth. It was during these winter months that Sarah's transformation solidified. With little to do but huddle for warmth and occasionally venture out to hunt, her remaining human memories faded further. By the time spring arrived, bringing fresh growth and more plentiful prey, Sarah Mitchell, the human child, existed only in the most shadowy corners of her mind. In her place was a creature the local trappers would later come to whisper about as the Wolf Girl, a wild being equally comfortable in the animal and human worlds, but belonging fully to neither. As her second year with the wolves began, Sarah had developed skills that would have amazed even the most experienced frontiersman. She could detect the scent of prey from remarkable distances, track animals through seemingly impossible terrain, and move through the forest with such stealth that birds would not take flight at her passing. Her hearing had sharpened to the point where she could identify individual members of the pack by the sound of their footfalls, and her night vision had developed far beyond normal human capability. The pack's territory expanded as the two young wolves reached maturity, and Sarah ranged with them across an area spanning nearly 20 square miles. Occasionally, they would encounter human hunters or trappers at the edges of their domain, and at these times, the alpha female would lead the pack, including Sarah, into deeper wilderness until the human scent faded. But as fate would have it, Sarah's life among the wolves was destined to be discovered. In the early spring of 1876, nearly 4 years after the massacre, a solitary hunter named Ezekiel Thompson ventured into the remote valley in search of beaver pelts. Thompson was a former Army scout who had left military service to pursue the life of a mountain man. At 43, he had the weathered face and cautious demeanor of a man who had survived through wit and skill in unforgiving territories. Thompson established a small camp near a beaver dam and set his traps. On the second morning, he noticed unusual tracks near one of his trap sites, wolf prints certainly, but among them something odd. What appeared to be a child's footprint, but misshapen, elongated, as if the foot had never worn shoes and had adapted to a life of running across uneven ground. Intrigued and disturbed by this discovery, Thompson began to pay closer attention to the signs around him. He found strands of what appeared to be human hair caught on a tree branch near a game trail. Later that day, while checking his trap line, he caught a fleeting glimpse of what he first took to be a small, dirty-haired wolf slipping into the underbrush. But something in its movement struck him as not quite an animal. That night, as he sat by his campfire, Thompson heard the wolves howling from a ridge to the north. Years of experience had taught him to distinguish between their calls, warnings, hunting coordination, territorial claims. But among the familiar sounds came something that raised the hair on his neck, a howl that held the faintest echo of a human voice. Thompson was a practical man, not given to superstition or flights of fancy, yet he found himself unable to dismiss what his senses were telling him. The next morning, he packed his minimal gear and followed the wolf tracks north toward the ridge where the howls had originated. His years as a scout had made him an expert tracker, but he proceeded with unusual caution, aware that he was pursuing something beyond his experience. By midday, Thompson had located the general area where the wolf pack seemed to be denning. From a concealed position, he observed them through his spyglass. 7 adult wolves, and what appeared to be a small, human-like figure moving among them with complete comfort. The figure walked sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on all 4s, its body covered in a layer of dirt and what remained of a self-made covering of animal hides. Thompson watched, transfixed, as this wild child participated in the pack's activities, helping to guard 2 new pups while older wolves went hunting, drinking from a stream in the animal fashion by lapping rather than scooping with hands. Most remarkably, the child seemed to communicate with the wolves through an elaborate system of body language and vocalizations that the animals clearly understood. As the day waned and Thompson prepared to withdraw before losing daylight, the wind shifted, and suddenly the entire pack went alert. The alpha female raised her head, sniffing the air, and stared directly toward Thompson's hiding place. A warning growl rippled through the pack, and in an instant they were moving, including the wild child, who loped alongside them with practiced ease. But Thompson had seen enough. There was a human child living with these wolves, a child who, by all appearances, had been with them for years. How this had happened, he couldn't begin to guess, but as a God-fearing man, he felt duty-bound to investigate further. What Thompson couldn't know was that his presence had awakened something in Sarah that had lain dormant for nearly 4 years. The distant scent of wood smoke, the glimpse of a human figure, these triggered fragments of memory that flashed through her mind like summer lightning. For the first time in years, dreamlike images of faces, her mother, her father, her siblings, rose to the surface of her consciousness, though she had no context for these visions and no language to describe them. That night, as the pack settled, in a secondary denning site farther from the perceived human threat, Sarah was restless. The alpha female, sensing her distress, stayed close, occasionally licking Sarah's face in the wolf gesture of reassurance. But the child's world had been disturbed in ways that wolf comfort couldn't address, and so began the collision of 2 worlds. The civilization that Sarah had fled and the wild existence she had embraced. Thompson, determined to confirm what he had seen and possibly rescue what he viewed as a lost soul, would pursue the pack deeper into the wilderness. The outcome of this pursuit would forever alter Sarah's existence and challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature, civilization, and what it truly means to be raised by a family, whether human or not. Ezekiel Thompson spent his 3rd day in the wilderness, following the wolf pack at a respectful distance. His years as an army scout had taught him patience, a virtue that had kept him alive while many other frontiersmen had perished through recklessness or haste. He maintained his distance, observing through his spyglass whenever the terrain allowed, building a mental map of the pack's movements and habits. By nightfall, Thompson had confirmed beyond any doubt that what moved among the wolves was indeed a human child. Through his glass, he had caught clear glimpses of her face, dirt-streaked and weathered, but unmistakably that of a young girl perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Her movements fascinated him. She didn't merely imitate the wolves. She moved as one of them, with the same fluid economy, the same instinctive coordination with the pack. That evening, as Thompson huddled near a small, well-shielded fire, he made notes in the journal he had carried through 15 years on the frontier, April 17, 1876. The child appears thoroughly integrated with the wolf pack. Observed her participating in what appeared to be a hunting formation, taking position as a flanker, while 2 adult wolves drove a young deer. She does not behave as a captive or even an adoptee, but as a member. Most remarkable is her apparent comprehension of the wolves' communication system. When the alpha female made a specific yipping sound, the child immediately altered her position in response. I cannot fathom the circumstances that led to this extraordinary situation, but I am now convinced that retrieving her to human society is a moral imperative. The next morning, Thompson changed his approach. Rather than following, he moved ahead of the pack's projected path and established himself near a game trail that his tracking suggested they would use. His plan was simple but risky. He would allow himself to be scented and seen, but in a non-threatening posture. Then, over days if necessary, he would gradually decrease the distance between them, acclimating the wolves and the child to his presence. It was a technique he had used with feral horses in his younger days. the slow building of familiarity, before any attempt at contact. But wolves were not horses, and he kept his rifle close at hand. By mid-morning, the strategy yielded its first result. The pack approached the area, detected his scent, and froze. The alpha male's hackles rose, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Thompson remained perfectly still, seated on a fallen log with his hands visible and empty, his rifle propped against a tree just out of immediate reach. A calculated risk. The wolves held their position for nearly 20 minutes, neither advancing nor retreating, assessing this strange human who made no move toward them. Finally, the alpha female made a decision. With a subtle motion, she directed the pack to circle wide around the perceived threat. They complied, melting into the underbrush with practiced silence, all except the child. For reasons Thompson would never fully understand, Sarah didn't immediately follow the pack's evasive maneuver. Instead, she remained half-hidden behind a pine tree, her wild eyes fixed on the motionless hunter. Thompson met her gaze steadily, but made no sudden movements. "Hello there," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Don't be afraid." The words themselves meant nothing to Sarah. Language had faded from her consciousness years ago, but the gentle tone triggered something deep in her memory. She tilted her head slightly, in the manner of a wolf encountering something puzzling, but not immediately threatening. Thompson slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew a strip of jerked venison. With deliberate movements, he placed it on the ground before him and then retreated 2 steps. Sarah's nostrils flared. Food was food, and despite her integration with the wolves, she retained a human omnivore's opportunistic flexibility. After a moment's hesitation, she dropped to all fours and crept forward, stopping frequently to assess the threat. When she reached the jerky, she snatched it and retreated quickly, but not back to the forest where the pack had disappeared. Instead, she moved to a boulder about 30 feet from Thompson and crouched there, tearing at the dried meat with teeth that had adapted to a carnivore's diet. As she ate, Thompson spoke again, maintaining the same gentle tone, not caring that the words held no meaning for her. It was the human voice he wanted her to grow accustomed to, the cadence and rhythm so different from wolf vocalizations. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you? Wonder how that happened. Wonder who you are or were." Sarah finished the jerky and studied Thompson with unnerving intensity. Her eyes, Thompson noted, were green, startlingly so against her dirt-darkened skin. Intelligence shone in them, not the simple animal awareness of her wolf companions, but something more complex. Despite her feral state, this was a human mind, observing and calculating. A distant howl broke the moment, the alpha female calling the pack to regroup. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. Without hesitation, she bounded away, initially on all fours for speed, before rising to a bipedal run that, while awkward after years of disuse, still showed her human anatomical heritage. Thompson didn't pursue it. This first encounter had gone better than he had dared hope. The child had accepted food from him and had shown curiosity rather than pure fear. He would build on that foundation. Over the next 3 days, Thompson enacted his patient strategy. Each morning, he positioned himself near the pack's path, always visible, always still, always with food offered. Sarah's appearances became more regular, her approaches more direct. By the 3rd day, she was taking jerky directly from his outstretched. And though she still maintained a vigilant distance otherwise, the wolves themselves remained wary, observing from cover but never approaching. Thompson noted that they didn't attempt to drive Sarah away from these interactions, further evidence of the unusual relationship between the child and the pack. In most wolf societies, such independent action by a pack member would be corrected, sometimes harshly. Their tolerance suggested that Sarah occupied a unique position in their social structure. On the fourth day, rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the forest floor into a soggy morass. Thompson sheltered beneath an overhanging rock face, keeping a small fire burning despite the damp. He didn't expect any contact with Sarah or the wolves in such conditions. Most wildlife sought shelter during heavy rains. He was therefore startled when, in the late afternoon, a bedraggled figure emerged from the curtain of rain and stood at the edge of his shelter. Sarah was shivering violently, her matted hair plastered to her skull, her makeshift hide providing little protection against the cold downpour. Instinct overrode caution. Thompson grabbed his wool blanket and slowly approached her, holding it out. "You're half frozen, child. Come to the fire." Perhaps it was the extremity of her discomfort, or perhaps some deeply buried human memory of seeking shelter from the elements. But Sarah allowed him to drape the blanket around her shoulders. With gentle pressure, he guided her toward the fire. She crouched beside it, extending her hands to the flames with what appeared to be practiced familiarity. This small gesture told Thompson volumes. She had known fire before her time with the wolves. She'd been old enough when separated from human society to retain some fundamental human behaviors. As her shivering subsided, Thompson risked moving closer until they sat side by side before the fire. He spoke continuously, in low, soothing tones, establishing a human presence that was neither threatening nor demanding. When he offered her a tin cup of hot coffee, heavily sweetened with sugar, she sniffed it suspiciously before taking a cautious sip. The taste, sweet and bitter simultaneously, triggered a cascade of sensory memories. Sarah's eyes widened, and she made a small sound in her throat, something between a wolf's whimper and a human gasp. She drank the rest quickly, then held out the cup for more, making the first deliberately communicative gesture toward Thompson that wasn't directly related to taking offered food. "You remember that, do you?" Thompson murmured, refilling the cup. "Reckon you weren't always running with wolves." As evening deepened into night, the rain continued unabated. Sarah made no move to leave the shelter, instead curling up near the quay. Fire in a posture reminiscent of her wolf companions, Thompson maintained his position, careful not to crowd her, and eventually stretched out on his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. He woke once in the night to find her watching him, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the dying firelight. There was no fear in her gaze, only intense curiosity. He added wood to the fire without speaking and settled back into his bedroll. When he next opened his eyes, dawn was breaking, and Sarah was gone, along with his blanket and a chunk of salt. Pork from his provisions. Thompson smiled to himself. The child might be feral, but she had a human's appreciation for useful items and portable food. More importantly, the extended contact had established a foundation of trust, however tenuous. Over the next week, Thompson's patient approach yielded increasing results. Sarah's visits became daily occurrences, and each time she stayed a little longer. She began to sleep near his camp when darkness fell, though she always departed at first light, presumably to rejoin the pack. The wolves themselves maintained their distance, but Thompson occasionally glimpsed them watching from the tree line. They seemed to be allowing these interactions, which struck Thompson as remarkable. Communication remained primitive. Sarah neither spoke nor showed any comprehension of speech, but a rudimentary sign language developed between them. A gesture for food, another for water. A raised hand that meant "stay back" or "wait." Simple, but effective. The breakthrough came on the 9th day. Thompson had been whittling a piece of pine, fashioning a crude animal figure, a wolf, appropriately enough. Sarah watched the process with fascination, edging closer than she had ever voluntarily come before. When he finished, Thompson held out the wooden wolf to her. Sarah took it, turning it over in hands that, despite years of rough living, still possessed the dexterity unique to humans. Her fingers traced the shape, recognizing what it represented. Then she did something that stopped Thompson's breath. She pointed to the carving, then to herself, and made a soft howling sound. "Yes," Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what you've been, isn't it? One of them." Then Sarah pointed to Thompson, then to herself again, and tilted her head in a questioning manner. The meaning was clear enough. "Are we the same?" "Yes," Thompson said again. "You and I, we're the same kind, humankind, though you've been away from your own people for quite a spell, I reckon." That night, Sarah didn't disappear at dawn. She remained at the camp, watching as Thompson prepared a breakfast of coffee and johnny cakes. When he offered her a plate, she took it and mimicked his eating posture, awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence. It was as if layers of wildness were being peeled away, revealing glimpses of the human child beneath. By midday, Thompson had made a decision. The trust between them had progressed far enough that he believed he could bring Sarah back to human society without force or trauma. The wolf pack would remain in their territory. They wouldn't follow into areas heavily trafficked by humans. If he could get Sarah to accompany him voluntarily to his cabin, a 2-day journey to the southeast, the first major step in her reintegration would be accomplished. Explaining this plan to someone who understood no words presented a considerable challenge. Thompson resolved to use their rudimentary sign language and the power of example. He packed his gear methodically, pointing to the sun and making walking motions, then pointing southeast. He indicated that Sarah should come with him by patting his chest, then hers, then making the walking sign again. Sarah watched these preparations with evident anxiety. Several times, she moved to the edge of the camp, looking toward the direction where the wolf pack had last been seen. Thompson didn't rush her or attempt to prevent these movements. The choice had to be hers. As Thompson shouldered his pack and prepared to depart, Sarah stood at the forest's edge, visibly torn between the human world that was awakening dim memories and the wolf family that had been her reality for 4 years. Thompson took a few steps along the game trail, then turned and extended his hand. "Come on, child," he said gently. "Time to come home." For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. Then, with a last glance toward the deep woods, she padded forward and placed her small, calloused hand in Thompson's weathered palm. The journey to Thompson's cabin took longer than the predicted 2 days. Sarah's willingness to accompany him fluctuated. Sometimes she walked beside him on the trail. Other times she ranged ahead or behind, disappearing into the underbrush for hours before rejoining him. Twice, Thompson heard wolf howls in the distance and feared she had returned to the pack, but each time she reappeared, seemingly reassured by checking on her wolf family but choosing to continue with him. Thompson's cabin stood in a small clearing backed by a limestone bluff with a creek running nearby. He had built it 5 years earlier as a base for his trapping operations. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a plank table, 2 chairs, a bed, and various storage chests. A lean-to at the back housed his tools and furs. Sarah approached the cabin warily, circling it twice before allowing Thompson to usher her inside. The enclosed space clearly made her uneasy. She kept glancing at the door and the single window, assessing escape routes. Thompson left both unlatched, understanding her need for the option of flight. That first evening in the cabin established patterns that would hold for weeks. Sarah refused the bed, instead creating a nest of blankets in the corner farthest from the door, but with a clear line of sight to it. She accepted cooked food, but showed particular enthusiasm for raw vegetables from Thompson's small garden, turnips and early spring greens that she devoured with evident delight. Most significantly, she tolerated water warmed over the fire and, with Thompson's gentle encouragement, allowed him to wash away years of accumulated grime from her face and hands. The transformation was striking. Beneath the dirt emerged a child with fair skin now deeply tanned, freckles across her nose, and those remarkable green eyes that had first caught Thompson's attention. Her hair presented a greater challenge. Years of neglect had created a mass of tangles that no amount of patient combing could fully address. Eventually, Thompson used his hunting knife to cut away the worst mats, reducing her once long blonde tresses to a ragged short cap that nonetheless framed her face in a way that emphasized her emerging humanity. Clothing was cobbled together from Thompson's spares, a flannel shirt that hung to her knees, secured with a length of rope, and moccasins fashioned from a piece of deer hide. Sarah tolerated these concessions to human convention with obvious discomfort at first, repeatedly tugging at the unfamiliar constraints, but gradually adapted. For the first month, Thompson made no attempt to leave the cabin or its immediate surroundings. He focused entirely on establishing routines and rebuilding Sarah's connection to human ways. He demonstrated tools and their uses: cups, spoons, the broom, the water bucket. He modeled behaviors, sitting at the table for meals, washing hands before eating, using the outhouse rather than the woods. Throughout this process, Sarah revealed an intelligence that impressed the seasoned frontiersman. She observed carefully and quickly incorporated new skills. Within weeks, she was helping to prepare simple meals, carrying water from the creek, and even attempting to sweep the cabin floor, though her technique left much to be desired. Language remained the greatest hurdle. Sarah made sounds. Sometimes wolf-like vocalizations, sometimes guttural noises that seemed like attempts at human speech. Thompson spoke constantly, naming objects, describing actions, telling simple stories in the evenings by the fire. Sarah listened with increasing attention and occasionally echoed sounds, but no recognizable words emerged. Thompson began to wonder about her history. How had a child so young come to be alone in the wilderness? The territories were dangerous, with conflicts between settlers and native tribes, outlaw gangs preying on travelers, and the natural hazards of the frontier claiming many lives. Had her family been attacked? Had she become lost? Without language, Sarah couldn't explain, and Thompson had no way to investigate. As spring warmed into early summer, Thompson faced practical considerations. His supplies were running low, and he needed to make his regular trip to Fort Sullivan, the nearest trading post, some 30 miles distant. The journey would take 4 days round trip, too long to leave Sarah alone at the cabin, but potentially traumatic for her if he brought her into contact with other humans too soon. After much deliberation, he decided she must accompany him. To prepare her, he began taking her on progressively longer excursions from the cabin, first on foot, then on horseback. Sarah adapted to riding with surprising ease, suggesting she had done so before her time with the wolves. On a clear June morning, they set out for Fort Sullivan. Sarah rode behind Thompson on his mare, gripping his jacket with white-knuckled intensity as they followed the rough trail through the mountains. That night, camped beside a small stream, Thompson detected a new tension in her. She paced the perimeter of their camp, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness, her head cocked as if listening for something beyond human hearing. "There aren't any wolves this close to settled areas," Thompson explained, though he knew she didn't understand the words. "Your family is far behind us now." But Sarah's restlessness continued. Twice during the night, Thompson awoke to find her gone from the camp, only to discover her perched on a nearby rock, facing northwest, the direction of the territory where her wolf pack roamed. By morning, shadows darkened the skin beneath her eyes, but she mounted obediently behind Thompson when he prepared to continue their journey. They reached Fort Sullivan by mid-afternoon the following day. The trading post consisted of a stockaded compound containing a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small church, and a dozen cabins housing the handful of permanent residents. A few teepees stood outside the walls. members of the friendly Shoshone tribe who traded regularly with the post. Thompson had considered how best to introduce Sarah to this relatively busy human settlement. He decided on a direct but controlled approach. Rather than taking her immediately into the general store with its likely crowd, he made for the cabin of Martha Reynolds, the post's closest approximation to a doctor. Martha was a widow in her 50s who had come west with her husband and remained after his death, supporting herself by providing medical care based on knowledge gathered from her physician father. Thompson had sent word ahead with a passing trapper 2 weeks earlier, explaining his extraordinary find in general terms and requesting Martha's assistance. As they dismounted before her cabin, the door opened and Martha emerged, a tall, angular woman with iron-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes softened by humor lines at their corners. "Ezekiel Thompson," she called in greeting. "I was beginning to think your wild child was another of your tall tales." "No tale this time, Martha," Thompson replied, keeping his voice casual for Sarah's benefit. "Here's the girl I mentioned. Doesn't speak, doesn't remember her name, far as I can tell. Been living rough for a good long while." Martha's experienced eyes took in Sarah's appearance, the improvised clothing, the roughly cut hair, the wariness in her posture. Most tellingly, she noted how the girl positioned herself slightly behind Thompson, but with a clear view of all approaches, weight balanced to flee if necessary. "Bring her inside," Martha said, her voice gentling. "Slowly now," Sarah allowed herself to be guided into the cabin, though she balked at the threshold, requiring gentle encouragement from Thompson. Once inside, she immediately conducted the same assessment she had performed at Thompson's cabin, locating exits, scanning for threats, establishing a defensible position in a corner. Martha observed this behavior with clinical interest. "How long do you reckon she was alone?" "Not alone," Thompson corrected, "with wolves." "At least 3 years, maybe 4 by my estimation." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Wolves? Ezekiel, are you spinning yarns again?" "Gospel truth," Thompson insisted. "Found her running with a pack up in the high country, moving like them, communicating with them. Took me the better part of 2 weeks just to get her to trust me enough to come close." "With wolves," Martha repeated, studying Sarah with new intensity. "Well, that would explain a few things about her posture and movements. I've heard stories, of course, feral children raised by animals. Never thought I'd see such a case myself." She approached Sarah slowly, hands visible, voice gentle. "Hello, little one, I'm Martha. I'm going to help you and Mr. Thompson figure out who you are." Sarah watched her warily, but didn't retreat. When Martha cautiously extended a hand, palm up, in the non-threatening gesture Thompson had taught her, Sarah sniffed it in the wolf manner before allowing the brief contact. "Well, that's a start," Martha said with satisfaction. "Now, Ezekiel, tell me everything from the beginning." As Thompson related the full story of finding Sarah and the progress they had made over the past months, Martha occasionally approached the girl, making slow, non-threatening examinations, looking at her eyes, her skin, the calluses on her hands and feet. Sarah tolerated these attentions with increasing calm, seemingly recognizing another human who intended no harm. "She's malnourished, but not severely so," Martha concluded. "Some healed injuries. That scar on her forearm looks like a burn. That one on her calf might be from a predator's claws. Physically, with proper food and care, she should recover fully." She lowered her voice, though it was unlikely Sarah could understand. "Her mind is another matter. The longer a child remains isolated from human language and interaction, the harder it becomes to recover those capabilities. At her age, what would you guess, 9, 10? There's hope, but it won't be easy." "She's smart," Thompson said. "Pick things up quickly, just can't seem to manage words yet," Martha nodded thoughtfully. "The capacity for language has a critical period in childhood. If she was old enough to speak before, whatever happened to her?" then that foundation may still exist buried in her mind. We'll need to find the key to unlocking it. What neither Thompson nor Martha could know was that the key already existed, triggered by their journey away from the wolf territory, by the increasing human contact, by the buried memories slowly rising to the surface of Sarah's consciousness. That night, as she lay on a pallet in Martha's cabin, strange dreams flickered through her mind, faces, voices, the sensation of being held in loving arms. And somewhere in those dreams a name emerged, not her own, but one spoken with love by a woman's voice. "Emma," Sarah whispered in her sleep, the first human word to pass her lips in 4 years. "Emma." Martha Reynolds stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching as Sarah cautiously explored the small herb garden beside the path. The girl moved with an unusual gait, fluid and balanced, but with a slight forward lean that hinted at her years of running on all fours. 2 days at Fort Sullivan had not diminished her alertness. Her head turned at each new sound, her nostrils flared to catch unfamiliar scents. "She's extraordinary," Martha murmured to Thompson, who was repairing a loose shutter nearby. "I've treated children who were neglected or abandoned, but nothing like this. The way she adapts," Thompson nodded, hammering a nail into place. "Like she's caught between 2 worlds. Got the instincts of both, belongs to neither." That morning had brought a development that left both adults cautiously optimistic. While sharing breakfast, Sarah had pointed to the steaming cup Martha placed before her and made a sound unmistakably like hot. Whether she had remembered the word or was mimicking something Thompson had repeatedly said wasn't clear, but it was the first recognizable English she had produced while awake. "I've been thinking," Martha said, lowering her voice, "there might be a way to discover who she is, who she was before." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Been wondering about that myself. Hard to make inquiries without anything to go on." "Not entirely without," Martha countered. "Lieutenant Brooks is due here next week with the cavalry patrol from Fort Laramie. They keep records of settler movements, Indian attacks, and missing persons. If a child disappeared in these territories within the last few years, they might have some information." Thompson considered this. "Worth asking, though if her folks are gone—" He left the implication hanging. "Then decisions will need to be made about her future," Martha finished. "But first, let's see if we can find out who Sarah Mitchell really is." The name had been Martha's suggestion, a temporary identity to use until the girl's true name was discovered. Sarah seemed to accept it, turning her head when called, though whether she recognized it as a name or simply as a sound directed at her remained unclear. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor, Reverend James Hollister, who operated the small church within the stockade. He approached with deliberate slowness, having been warned about Sarah's wariness of strangers. "Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Thompson," he greeted them with a tip of his hat. "I thought I might pay my respects to our new arrival." Sarah had retreated to Martha's side at the newcomer's approach, but didn't flee. "Progress," Thompson noted silently. "Good morning, Reverend," Martha replied. "Sarah, this is Reverend Hollister. He's a friend." Hollister crouched to bring himself to Sarah's eye level, maintaining a non-threatening distance. "Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Fort Sullivan." Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to assess more than appearance, as if she were reading his scent, his posture, the minute tells that might reveal danger. After a moment, she relaxed slightly. "Remarkable," Hollister murmured. "Thompson, you mentioned finding her with wolves." "Living as part of the pack," Thompson confirmed. "Never seen anything like it." "There are precedents in literature," Hollister said thoughtfully. "Romulus and Remus of Rome, raised by a she-wolf. Various accounts throughout history, though few with credible witnesses. This one's real enough," Thompson assured him. "Question is what happens to her now." "Indeed." Hollister stood, brushing dust from his knees. "The Lord clearly preserved this child for a purpose. Our duty is to help her find her way back to human society. Martha's expression suggested she found the Reverend's theological certainty somewhat premature, but she nodded politely. We're taking it one day at a time. Sarah needs to relearn many things before we can determine the best path forward. That afternoon brought another first. As Martha was showing Sarah how to shell peas from the garden, a young Shoshone woman appeared at the gate with her infant son. Martha had delivered the baby 2 months earlier and regularly checked on mother and child. She invited them in, carefully monitoring Sarah's reaction to the newcomers. Sarah's attention fixed immediately on the baby. She approached with uncharacteristic directness, her head tilted in evident curiosity. The Shoshone mother, who had been briefed on Sarah's unusual background, remained calm as the feral child drew near. With exquisite gentleness that belied her wild upbringing, Sarah extended a finger toward the infant. The baby grasped it reflexively, and a transformation came over Sarah's face, a softening, a wonder, and then, astonishingly, a smile. It was the first true smile Thompson or Martha had seen from her. "Well now," Martha said softly, "seems some human instincts run deeper than we thought." The interaction lasted only minutes before Sarah retreated to her corner, apparently overwhelmed by the new experience. But the moment left a profound impression on the adults who witnessed it. Beneath the layers of wildness, a human child remained. One, capable of connection and potentially reintegration. The next morning brought a new challenge. Thompson needed to complete his trading business at the fort's general store, and after discussion with Martha, they decided Sarah should accompany them rather than remain alone at the cabin. This would be her first exposure to a larger group of humans since her rescue. They prepared her as best they could. Martha found a simple calico dress that had belonged to her niece, and though Sarah initially resisted the unfamiliar garment, she eventually allowed herself to be clothed. Her hair was combed and tied back with a ribbon, transforming her appearance dramatically. Looking at her, Thompson felt a tightening in his chest. She looked so much like any frontier child, it was easy to forget how far she had to travel to truly rejoin human society. "Now remember," Martha instructed as they approached the store, "people will be curious. They've heard rumors. Just stay close to us, and we won't stay long." Sarah walked between them, her hand occasionally brushing Thompson's, as if reassuring herself of his presence. Her eyes darted everywhere, cataloguing threats and escape routes with the instincts honed by her years in the wild. The general store was busy that morning. Settlers from outlying homesteads stocking up on supplies, a few soldiers from the small detachment stationed at the fort, and the store's proprietor, Walter Jenkins, a garrulous man with an opinion on everything. A hush fell as they entered, all eyes turning to the strange girl accompanying Thompson and Martha. Sarah froze momentarily, her body tensing like a deer sensing predators. Thompson placed a reassuring hand lightly on her shoulder. "Folks," he acknowledged the room with a nod, "just here for trading. Go about your business." Some did, with sideways glances. Others continued to stare openly. Walter Jenkins approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "So this is the wolf girl I've been hearing about," he said, examining Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "Doesn't look much like a wolf to me." "She's a child who survived an ordeal most adults wouldn't," Martha corrected firmly. "And she understands more than you might think, Walter, so mind your manners." Jenkins had the grace to look abashed. "No offense meant, Mrs. Reynolds. It's just not every day we get such an interesting visitor." While Thompson conducted his business, trading furs for supplies and settling accounts, Martha kept Sarah occupied at the candy counter, showing her how to select a peppermint stick. Sarah's reaction to the sweet was another revelation. Her eyes widened at the taste, and she made a sound that might have been pleasure. The relative success of this outing emboldened them to expand Sarah's experiences gradually. Over the next few days, she accompanied them to other parts of the settlement. The blacksmith's forge, where the glowing fire initially frightened her until she understood it was controlled. The small schoolhouse, empty for the summer, but filled with fascinating objects like slates and chalk. The stable, where she showed particular affinity for the horses. Throughout these experiences, Sarah's language development accelerated. More recognizable words emerged: water, horse, no, used appropriately if not always clearly pronounced. She began responding to simple instructions and questions, though complex communication remained beyond her grasp. 5 days after their arrival at Fort Sullivan, the anticipated cavalry patrol rode in, led by Lieutenant Daniel Brooks, a young West Point graduate with a serious demeanor that masked a compassionate nature. Thompson had met him on previous visits and respected his fairness in dealing with both settlers and native tribes. Thompson and Martha arranged to meet with Brooks privately before introducing Sarah. They gathered in Reverend Hollister's small church office, where Thompson explained the full circumstances of finding Sarah and their efforts to reintegrate her into human society. Brooks listened attentively, making occasional notes. When Thompson finished, the lieutenant rubbed his clean-shaven chin thoughtfully. A child surviving with wolves. Extraordinary. And you believe she may have been separated from her family through some violent incident? It's our working theory, Martha confirmed. The way she reacted to certain stimuli initially, loud noises, sudden movements, suggests trauma. And children don't typically wander into the wilderness alone. Brooks nodded gravely. I'll review our records of incidents in that region over the past 4 to 5 years. Attacks on settlers, missing persons reports. Though I must warn you, our documentation is far from comprehensive. The territories are vast, and many tragedies go unreported. Anything you can find would help, Thompson said. The girl deserves to know where she came from, if possible. There's another consideration, Martha added hesitantly. If she has living relatives searching for her. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would happen to Sarah if they found her family? After these months with Thompson, after her years with the wolves, could she simply be returned to a former life she barely remembered? Brooks promised to begin his research immediately and suggested they introduce Sarah to him the following day, once she had grown accustomed to the idea. That evening, as they sat by Martha's fireplace, Thompson attempted to prepare Sarah for the meeting. He showed her a cavalry button Brooks had given him on a previous visit and explained that a man in a blue uniform would be coming to talk with them. Sarah seemed to understand at some level. She touched the button, then pointed to herself, then made a questioning gesture that had become part of their rudimentary communication system. That's right, Thompson affirmed. He might know something about you, about where you came from. Sarah's response was unexpected. She crawled to Martha's small bookshelf and pulled out a volume she had shown interest in previously, a children's picture book with colorful illustrations of families and homes. She brought it to Thompson and opened it to a page showing a mother, father, and children standing before a farmhouse. Pointing to the family, she then pressed her hand to her chest and made a soft, keening sound that raised the hair on Thompson's arms. It was not quite human grief, not quite wolf mourning, but something haunting in between. Yes, Thompson said softly, emotion thickening his voice. Your family. That's what we're trying to find out. That night, Sarah's sleep was restless. Martha reported hearing her cry out several times, forming syllables that might have been names. Might have been pleas. The process of remembering had begun, and like many healing processes, it brought pain before resolution. The meeting with Lieutenant Brooks the next morning proceeded better than they had dared hope. Sarah, though initially wary of his uniform and formal bearing, seemed to recognize him as no threat. Brooks, for his part, showed remarkable sensitivity, speaking softly and maintaining distance until Sarah indicated she was comfortable with his presence. He brought a slate map of the territories and spread it on Martha's table. Thompson pointed out the approximate location where he had found Sarah with the wolf pack. Brooks marked it, then indicated several spots within a 50-mile radius. "We have records of 3 significant violent incidents in this general area during the time frame we're considering," he explained. An attack on a logging camp in '72, attributed to a renegade band of Crow. A stagecoach robbery turned murderous the same year, and the Carson Reed Massacre in July 1872, where a wagon train was attacked by bandits. At the mention of Carson Reed, something changed in Sarah's demeanor. Her head snapped up, and she stared at Brooks with an intensity that stopped conversation. Brooks, noting her reaction, continued carefully. The Carson Reed party consisted of 12 families traveling from Independence to Montana Territory. They were attacked by the Blackwell Gang on July 27, 1872. It was thorough. Initial reports indicated no survivors, though a teenage boy was later found alive. He had hidden beneath a wagon during the attack. Sarah had begun to tremble visibly. Thompson moved to her side, but she didn't seem to register his presence. Her eyes remained fixed on Brooks, or perhaps on something only she could see. "Do you have names?" Martha asked quietly. Of the families in the wagon train, Brooks consulted his notebook. The report lists the Carson family, the Reeds, the Wilkins, the Cooks. The boy who survived was Timothy Cook, the Harrises, the Taylors. He continued down the list, watching Sarah carefully. The Burtons, the Millers, the Parkers, the Johnsons, the Whites, and the Mitchells. At Mitchell's, Sarah made a small, strangled sound. Her hands began to move, forming shapes. In the air, reaching, grasping at memories, breaking through the surface of consciousness. "Mitchell," Thompson repeated softly. "Sarah? Is that your name? Sarah Mitchell?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, the first they had seen from her. She nodded, a barely perceptible movement, then with growing certainty. Her lips moved, forming the word silently at first, then with a whispered voice. "Sarah Mitchell." The adults exchanged glances of amazement and sorrow. Brooks consulted his notes again, his expression grave. The Mitchell family consisted of Thomas and Mary Mitchell and their children, James, age 10, Sarah, age 6, and Emma, age 3. All were presumed killed in the attack. "Emma," Sarah whispered, the name she had spoken in her sleep days earlier. "Emma? Gone." Martha knelt beside her chair, taking the girl's cold hands in her warm ones. "Sarah, do you remember what happened to your family?" For a moment it seemed the question might push her back into silence. The trauma of remembering such violence might be too much for her fragile reconnection to language and human identity. But Sarah Mitchell had survived 4 years in the wilderness through extraordinary resilience. That same strength now allowed her to face the dark memories returning in fragments. "Bad men," she said haltingly, each word a painful extraction from years of silence. "Guns. Mama tried. Papa fell. James tried to help. Emma," her voice broke. "I covered Emma, tried to be quiet. Man found." She made a gesture, pantomiming, a small body being dragged away. "I stayed. Still blood. So much blood." She looked up at Thompson, tears streaming down her face. "I played dead." The room fell silent except for Sarah's ragged breathing. Thompson, Martha, and Brooks exchanged glances, each processing the horror of what the child had endured. Witnessing her family's murder, losing her baby sister despite her efforts to protect her, lying still among the bodies of her loved ones. To survive, the Blackwell gang was caught and hanged 6 months after the massacre, Brooks offered quietly. "If it's any consolation." It wasn't, of course. Justice executed on criminals could never restore what Sarah had lost. But the information completed a circle somehow. The story had an ending, even if it wasn't a happy one. "What about extended family?" Martha asked. Grandparents, aunts, uncles. Brooks consulted his notes again. The report mentions they were originally from Pennsylvania, a farming family. There may be relatives back east, but we'd need to send inquiries. Thompson had remained silent, watching Sarah process these revelations about her past. Now he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. There's no rush to make decisions. Sarah's been through enough. She needs time to heal, to remember more if she can, to decide what she wants. Martha nodded agreement. She stays with us for now. We can send inquiries about relatives, but Sarah's immediate well-being comes first. Sarah looked between them, understanding at least the tone, if not every word. She reached for Thompson's hand, then Martha's, bringing them together, a child creating her own circle of protection to replace the one she had lost. "Stay," she said simply. "With you." As evening fell over Fort Sullivan, Sarah sat on Martha's porch, watching the stars emerge. Her world had expanded tremendously in the short time since Thompson had coaxed her away from the wolf pack. From forest and cave to cabin and settlement, from animal communication to remembering human speech, from living entirely in the present to recovering her past. Inside, Thompson and Martha spoke in hushed tones about practical matters: Sarah's education, her legal status, the possibility of Thompson becoming her guardian. These were human concerns that would shape her future. But as a wolf howled in the distant hills, not her pack, but kin to them, Sarah lifted her face to the sound, acknowledging that part of herself that would always remember running free under the moon, being part of a different kind of family. The wolf child was becoming human again, but the wolf would always remain within her, a strength and a memory of survival against impossible odds. Autumn painted the hills surrounding Fort Sullivan in fiery hues of amber and crimson. 3 months had passed since Sarah Mitchell had first arrived at the settlement, and with each day her transformation progressed. The wild child, who had once moved on all fours and communicated through wolf-like vocalizations, now walked upright with increasing confidence and spoke in simple but coherent sentences. On a crisp October morning, Sarah sat at Martha Reynolds' kitchen table, laboriously forming letters on a slate. Martha had begun teaching her to read and write, starting with the basics most children mastered at age 5 or 6. Sarah's progress was remarkable, her mind sharpened by years of survival. Challenges absorbed knowledge with an intensity that sometimes startled her teachers. "That's excellent, Sarah," Martha praised, examining the wobbly but recognizable alphabet the girl had produced. "You're learning faster than many children who've had schooling all their lives." Sarah ducked her head, still uncomfortable with direct praise, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I remember some," she said haltingly, "from before." This was another development, fragments of her early education returning alongside memories of her family. In recent weeks, she had recalled her mother teaching her letters, her father reading Bible stories by firelight, her brother James teasing her about her serious approach to learning. The door opened and Ezekiel Thompson entered, stomping trail dust from his boots. He had been dividing his time between his cabin and Fort Sullivan, reluctant to separate from Sarah, but needing to maintain his trap lines as winter approached. "How's our scholar this morning?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Sarah jumped up and approached him with quick, light steps. Gone was the animal wariness that had marked her movements during the early days. She still retained an unusual grace and alertness, but it was now integrated into human patterns of behavior. "I wrote all the letters," she announced, holding up her slate. "So you did," Thompson confirmed, genuine pride warming his voice. "Pretty. Soon you'll be writing circles around me." Sarah's rehabilitation had become something of a community project at Fort Sullivan. Reverend Hollister visited several times a week, bringing picture books from which Sarah eagerly absorbed new vocabulary. Mrs. Jenkins, the storekeeper's wife, taught her simple cooking skills. Even Lieutenant Brooks, during his monthly patrol, stops, contributed maps and stories of the territories that seemed to fascinate the girl. Sarah's progress was not without setbacks. Nightmares disrupted her sleep several times a week, vivid reruns of the massacre that left her trembling and inconsolable. Certain sounds, a gunshot, a man's angry shout, could trigger a retreat into animal alertness, her body tensing to flee. And occasionally, during moments of frustration or strong emotion, her speech reverted to wolf-like sounds that better expressed her feelings than the English words still unfamiliar to her tongue. But these episodes grew less frequent as autumn deepened. With each passing week, Sarah Mitchell reclaimed more of her human identity while integrating rather than rejecting the survival skills her time with the wolves had taught her. "I've news," Thompson announced as they shared a simple lunch of cornbread and stew. "Got a letter from back east." Martha looked up sharply. They had sent inquiries to Pennsylvania regarding the Mitchell family, seeking any relatives who might claim Sarah. The responses so far had been dispiriting. Thomas Mitchell's parents had died years before, and his only brother had moved to California and proved untraceable. Mary Mitchell's sister responded, Thompson continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Elizabeth Caldwell, living in Harrisburg. She confirms that her sister's family set out for Montana Territory in 1872 and that they had 3 children matching the ages and descriptions we provided." Sarah watched this exchange intently, following the conversation with growing comprehension. "My aunt?" she asked, the concept clearly difficult for her to grasp after years without human family connections. "That's right," Thompson said gently. "Your mother's sister. She writes that she'd be willing to take you in, provide you with a proper home and education." A shadow crossed Sarah's face, not fear exactly, but uncertainty. Far away? Martha and Thompson exchanged glances. They had discussed this possibility extensively in private. What would be best for Sarah's future? A respectable home in the East with blood relatives offered advantages that the frontier couldn't match. Proper schooling, medical care, social opportunities. But it would also mean separation from the only humans she had connected with since her rescue, another wrenching transition for a child who had endured too many already. "Very far," Martha acknowledged. "It would mean a long journey by stagecoach and then by train, and living in a city with many people around all the time." Sarah considered this information with the seriousness that characterized her approach to all new concepts. "Would you come?" she asked Thompson directly. The hunter's weathered face revealed his struggle. "No, little one. My place is here in the mountains, but your aunt is your bloodkin. She could give you things I never could." Sarah fell silent, processing this information. When she finally spoke, her words held a wisdom beyond her years. "I need to think." For several days, Sarah withdrew into unusual quietness, observing the life of the settlement with renewed attention. She watched the few children at Fort Sullivan, playing, studied the women at their household tasks, noted the men going about their various trades. She asked pointed questions about life in cities, about trains and schools and churches. In the evenings, she would sometimes slip outside to stand at the edge of the stockade, gazing toward the distant mountains where she had run with the wolves. Thompson, watching her from a respectful distance, recognized the conflict within her. The pull between the wild freedom she had known and the human connections she was rebuilding. On the 4th night, Sarah approached Thompson as he sat mending a trap on Martha's porch. "I want to show you something," she said, her speech careful but clear. "Tomorrow, before I decide." Thompson agreed readily, curious about what the child had in mind. The next morning they set out on horseback, Sarah riding her own mount now, a gentle mare that Martha had purchased from a passing trader. Sarah led the way, with a confidence that surprised Thompson, navigating the trail northward into increasingly rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, they had traveled nearly 15 miles from Fort Sullivan. Sarah finally reined in her horse at the edge of a high meadow bordered by aspens, their golden leaves shimmering in the autumn light. "Here," she said simply, dismounting. Thompson followed suit, tethering the horses to a tree. Sarah moved across the meadow with purpose, approaching a rocky outcropping that overlooked a vast valley. She crouched there, indicating that Thompson should join her. Below them stretched a panorama of wilderness, forests, streams, distant mountains hazed blue in the afternoon light. A herd of elk grazed peacefully in a lower meadow, an eagle soaring on thermals, hunting. "This is where I would watch," Sarah explained, her voice taking on a different quality, more fluid, more connected to the landscape around them. "With Luna, the mother wolf, we would see everything from here, know where to hunt, where danger is." Thompson realized with a start that Sarah had brought him to a place from her time with the wolves, perhaps a boundary of the pack's territory, a place where the alpha female had taught her to observe and understand the patterns of the wilderness. "It's a good vantage point," he acknowledged, recognizing the tactical advantage of the position. "You could see for miles." Sarah nodded, pleased by his understanding. "Luna taught me to see, not just look, see." She pointed to subtle signs. In the landscape below, a slightly trampled area indicating where deer had bedded the previous night, the distant movement of a fox along a stream bed, the contrasting green of vegetation that revealed where a spring surfaced. For nearly an hour, they sat together, as Sarah pointed out features of the wilderness that would have been invisible to most human eyes, the signs and signals that had constituted her language during her years with the pack. Thompson, himself an experienced frontiersman, found himself humbled by the depth of her perception. Finally, Sarah turned to him, her green eyes grave. "The wolves gave me this. They taught me to survive when humans killed my family. They showed me a different way to live." She paused, struggling to express complex concepts with her limited vocabulary. "But humans gave me words again. Stories, letters," she touched her chest, "memories of who I was before, who I am." Thompson understood what this pilgrimage represented. Sarah's attempt to reconcile the two halves of her existence, to acknowledge what each had given her before making a choice about her future. "Both are part of you now," he said gently. "The wolf and the girl, whatever you decide, that won't change." Sarah nodded, relieved by his understanding. As the sun began its descent, they mounted and rode down from the high meadow, heading back toward Fort Sullivan. They had not gone far when Sarah suddenly reined in her horse, her head tilted in that wolf-like posture of alert listening. Thompson stopped beside her, scanning the forest for whatever had caught her attention. At first, he detected nothing unusual. Then, at the limits of his hearing, came a faint howl, answered by another. Sarah's face transformed, a complex mix of emotions chasing across her features. Without a word, she urged her horse into a clearing beside the trail and dismounted. Thompson followed, watching as she climbed atop a fallen log, cupped her hands around her mouth, and let out a howl that raised the hair on his arms. Not a child's imitation, but an authentic wolf vocalization that echoed across the valley. For several long moments, silence answered her. Then, from much closer than the original howls came a response, 3 distinct voices calling back. Sarah's breath caught. She turned to Thompson, her eyes wide. "It's them," she whispered. "Luna's pack." Thompson instinctively checked his rifle, but Sarah shook her head firmly. "No danger," she assured him. "They're just saying hello." They waited, Sarah standing perfectly still, her senses focused on the forest edge, 100 yards distant. Gradually, shapes materialized among the trees. 3 wolves, moving with cautious grace into the clearing's periphery. The largest, a grey female with a distinctive white patch on her chest, paused, her amber eyes fixed on Sarah. "Luna," Sarah breathed, taking an involuntary step forward. Thompson laid a gentle, restraining hand on her shoulder. "Careful, Sarah. They're still wild creatures, even if they remember you." But Sarah's confidence never wavered. "They won't hurt me, or you, if you stay with me." Slowly, maintaining a dignity that impressed even Thompson's experienced eye, the alpha female approached. Behind her, at a respectful distance, came two younger wolves, one male, one female, that Thompson guessed might be her offspring, perhaps. From the litter that had included the pups Sarah had first bonded with, 10 feet away, the alpha female stopped, her intelligent gaze taking in the changes in the human child she had once fostered. The clothes, the upright posture, the scent of human settlement now overlaying her natural odor. Sarah, responding to some ancient protocol remembered from her years with the pack, knelt and lowered her eyes slightly, a sign of respect without challenge. The wolf approached further, her movements deliberate. When she reached Sarah, she extended her muzzle, sniffing the girl thoroughly, reacquainting herself with a pack member long absent. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to Thompson's eyes, the wolf lightly pressed her head against Sarah's chest. A greeting, an acknowledgement, perhaps even a farewell. Sarah's arms went around the wolf's neck in a brief embrace. Words spilled from her in a mixture of English and the soft vocalizations she had used with the pack, an explanation, Thompson realized, of her absence and her new life, delivered in the only bilingual form the wolf might partially comprehend. The younger wolves approached then, circling Sarah, touching noses to her hands and face in their own greetings. For perhaps 5 minutes, this extraordinary reunion continued, a human child communing with the wild family that had preserved her life when her human family was destroyed. Then, with a soft whine, the alpha female stepped back. She gave Sarah one long, final look, then turned and trotted toward the forest, the younger wolves following. At the tree line she paused, looking back once more before disappearing into the shadows beneath the pines. Sarah remained kneeling in the clearing, tears streaming down her face. Thompson knelt beside her, placing an arm around her shoulders. "They came to say goodbye," Sarah said softly. "They understand I'm with my own kind now." The ride back to Fort Sullivan was quiet, both travelers absorbed in the significance of what they had witnessed. As the stockade came into view in the gathering dusk, Sarah finally spoke. "I've decided," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional day. "I will go to my aunt." Thompson nodded, unsurprised but feeling the weight of her decision nonetheless. "You're sure?" "Yes." Sarah's gaze was direct, more mature than her years. "The wolves taught me to survive. Now I need to learn how to live as a human again. My aunt can help with that part." 2 weeks later, the stagecoach that would begin Sarah's journey eastward stood ready outside Fort Sullivan's gates. Her few possessions were packed in a small trunk, clothes provided by the settlement's women, books given by Reverend Hollister, a wooden wolf carving made by Thompson. Lieutenant Brooks had arranged for her transportation and an escort to ensure her safe passage to Harrisburg. Martha fussed over last-minute details, tucking extra food into Sarah's travel bag, reminding her of the letters of introduction she carried explaining her unusual circumstances to those she would meet along the way. The entire settlement had gathered to see her off. Over the months of her residence, Sarah Mitchell had become something of a mascot to Fort Sullivan, a living testament to human resilience. When the time for goodbyes came, Sarah approached each person individually, thanking them in her careful English for their specific contributions to her recovery. She had progressed from single words to complex sentences, though her speech still carried a distinctive rhythm that hinted at her unconventional language development. To Reverend Hollister, who had spent countless hours reading to her from both religious and secular texts, she said, "Thank you for giving me back stories. They help me understand what happened and why." To Martha, who had mothered her with patient Practicality, she offered. You showed me how to be a girl again when I had forgotten. I will write to you when I reach Harrisburg. Finally, she turned to Thompson, the man who had found her running with wolves and had the wisdom to approach her with patience rather than fear. Words seemed inadequate for this farewell. Instead, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, a polished riverstone bearing a natural marking resembling a wolf's paw print, which she had found during one of their walks. "So you remember both of me," Sarah said, pressing it into his calloused palm. "The wolf girl and Sarah Mitchell." Her eyes, still carrying that unusual wildness beneath their human understanding, met him steadily. "They're the same person now." Thompson nodded, emotion making speech difficult. He had never had children of his own, had never expected to form a parental bond at this stage of his solitary life. Yet this extraordinary child had claimed a place in his heart that no one else had ever occupied. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he finally managed. "Prouder than I've ever been of anything in my life." The stagecoach driver called for passengers to board. With a final embrace for Thompson and Martha, Sarah climbed the steps and took her seat by the window. As the coach lurched into motion, she pressed her palm against the glass in farewell. Thompson watched until the dust cloud faded in the distance, then turned back toward the settlement gates. Martha fell into step beside him. "She'll be all right," Martha said with quiet confidence. "That girl survived a massacre and 4 years with wolves. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania doesn't stand a chance against her." Thompson smiled despite his heavy heart. "No, it surely doesn't." That evening, as he sat alone on Martha's porch watching the stars emerge, a wolf's howl echoed from the distant hills, a lone voice soon joined by others in haunting harmony. Thompson closed his eyes, listening to the wild chorus that had been Sarah's first language after losing her human family. The wolves were calling to each other across the valleys, maintaining the bonds of pack and territory that had sustained them for millennia. They weren't calling for Sarah. She had crossed a boundary back into the human world from which she had fled in terror years before. But as their song echoed under the vast Montana sky, Thompson liked to think they were acknowledging her journey. The extraordinary child who had moved between their world and his, carrying the wisdom of both. From his pocket, he withdrew the river stone Sarah had given him, its wolf paw marking clearly visible in the lamplight spilling from Martha's window. There were those who would never believe the story of the wolf girl of Fort Sullivan. It would become frontier legend, dismissed by rational minds as an exaggerated campfire tale. But Thompson knew the truth of it and had witnessed the miracle of a human child who survived the unthinkable through an alliance with creatures most humans feared. In doing so, she had demonstrated something profound about resilience, adaptation, and the complex bond between humans and the natural world they so often held at arm's length. Sarah Mitchell would grow up, would build a life far from the wilderness, where wolves had preserved her when humans had tried to destroy her. But somewhere in her heart, Thompson knew, she would always run with the pack under the Montana moon, wild and free and undefeated by tragedy. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift the wolves had given her, not just survival, but the wild. Courage to begin again, no matter what life had taken from her. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 1879. The grandfather clock in Elizabeth Caldwell's parlor chimed 3 times, its resonant tones echoing through the well-appointed 2-story home on Chestnut Street. Winter sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the polished hardwood floor, where 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat cross-legged with an open book. 3 years had passed since Sarah's arrival in Harrisburg, 3 years of remarkable transformation and adjustment. The wild child, who had once communicated in wolf vocalizations, now spoke in fluid, grammatically correct sentences, though her voice retained a distinctive cadence that set her apart from her peers. Her movements, while fully human, still carried a grace and alertness that betrayed her unusual upbringing. "Sarah, dear," called Elizabeth from the doorway, "the Richardsons will be arriving for dinner at 6. Would you please help me prepare the dining room?" Sarah looked up from her book, a volume on natural history that had captivated her for days, and nodded. "Of course, Aunt Elizabeth." Rising with the smooth economy of movement that characterized all her actions, Sarah placed a bookmark between the pages and set the book aside. She followed her aunt into the dining room, where the table awaited arrangement for their guests. Elizabeth Caldwell had proven to be exactly what Sarah needed: patient, structured, and neither overly indulgent nor unnecessarily strict. A childless widow of 45. When Sarah arrived, Elizabeth had approached her niece's unusual circumstances with practical compassion. She had hired tutors to address the gaps in Sarah's education, consulted with physicians about her physical development, and provided steady guidance on social expectations without attempting to erase the child's unique history. "The silverware goes on the outside, remember?" Elizabeth prompted gently as Sarah began setting the table. Sarah adjusted the forks with precise movements. "Outside to inside, in order of use," she recited, demonstrating her mastery of the rule. Elizabeth smiled approvingly. "Exactly right. The Richardsons' son William will be joining them tonight. He's about your age, 13, I believe." A slight tension appeared in Sarah's shoulders, a reaction so subtle that only someone who knew her history would recognize it. Social interactions with children her age remained challenging. Despite 3 years of integration into Harrisburg society, Sarah still found the unspoken rules of childhood relationships confusing and often arbitrary. Adults, with their clearer communication and more predictable behavior, were easier to understand. "Will they know?" Sarah asked quietly. "About me?" The question held layers of meaning Elizabeth understood immediately. Sarah's history had been shared selectively in Harrisburg. The official story, that she had been the sole survivor of a frontier tragedy and had lived alone in the wilderness before being rescued, was dramatic enough without including wolves. Only Elizabeth, their family physician Dr. Morris, and Sarah's primary tutor knew the full details of her years with the wolf pack. "No, dear," Elizabeth assured her. "Mr. Richardson is a business associate, not a close friend. They know only that you're my niece from the West who came to live with me after losing your parents." Relief softened Sarah's features. "Thank you." The Richardsons' visit proceeded smoothly, with Sarah demonstrating the social graces she had worked diligently to master. She answered questions about her studies politely, participated appropriately in dinner conversation, and even managed a brief exchange with William about the book of natural history she'd been reading. After the guests departed, Elizabeth found Sarah sitting by her bedroom window, gazing at the night sky where only a few stars were visible through Harrisburg's coal smoke and gaslight glow. "You did beautifully tonight," Elizabeth said, sitting beside her on the window seat. "I'm very proud of you." Sarah's lips curved in a small smile, but her eyes remained on the obscured stars. "I keep waiting," she admitted softly. "For what? A deer? To feel like I truly belong here." Sarah turned to her aunt, her expression troubled. "I've learned the rules, the words, how to dress and eat and behave like everyone else. But inside, I still feel different." Elizabeth considered her niece thoughtfully. In 3 years, they had rarely spoken directly about Sarah's time with the wolves. The child had shared fragments, information about wolf behavior that emerged. During their nature walks, occasional references to Luna when discussing concepts of family and protection. But the emotional core of that experience remained largely private, sealed behind a door Sarah rarely opened. "Perhaps you are different," Elizabeth suggested carefully. "And perhaps that's not something to overcome, but to accept." Sarah's gaze sharpened with interest. What do you mean? Your experiences have given you perspectives and abilities most people will never have, Elizabeth explained. That doesn't make you less human. It makes you uniquely human in a way that might sometimes feel lonely, but also offers special insights. Sarah pondered this idea, running her fingers along the window frame. Mr. Thompson said something similar once, that both parts of my life were valuable. It was the first time in months she had mentioned the frontiersman who had found her. Though Sarah corresponded regularly with both Thompson and Martha Reynolds, she rarely spoke of them or her time at Fort Sullivan. Elizabeth had sometimes wondered if the girl kept these memories separate, as if her life had been divided into distinct chapters that couldn't comfortably coexist. He was right, Elizabeth affirmed. And I've been thinking that perhaps it's time we found more constructive ways for you to use those unique perspectives. The next morning, Elizabeth presented Sarah with a proposal that would alter the course of her education. Rather than continuing exclusively with traditional tutoring, Sarah would begin assisting Dr. Morris 2 afternoons each week at his medical practice. The physician had expressed interest in Sarah's unusual knowledge of natural remedies, information she had gathered during her wilderness years and supplemented through avid reading since her return to civilization. Dr. Morris believes you have valuable insights about plant-based treatments that complement his medical training, Elizabeth explained, and he's willing to begin teaching you more formal aspects of medicine in return. Sarah's eyes widened with genuine excitement, the first Elizabeth had seen in some time. He would teach me to be a doctor? Eventually, perhaps, Elizabeth tempered, knowing the significant barriers women faced in entering the medical profession. For now, it would be an apprenticeship of sorts, an opportunity to contribute your knowledge while gaining new skills. 2 days later, Sarah entered Dr. Morris's modest office on Market Street for her first official session. The physician, a progressive-minded widower in his 50s who had treated Sarah since her arrival in Harrisburg, welcomed her with the respect he might show an adult colleague rather than a child assistant. "I've prepared a workspace for you," he said, leading her to a small desk positioned near his examination table. "And I've gathered these." He indicated several medical texts stacked neatly beside a blank journal. "I thought we might begin by documenting your knowledge of medicinal plants systematically. The frontier experience with natural remedies is valuable, but often lost because it isn't recorded properly." For the first time since leaving the wilderness, Sarah felt her unusual background being treated as an asset rather than an impediment. Dr. Morris didn't view her as a curiosity or a charity case, but as someone whose knowledge, however unconventionally obtained, had value. Over the following months, Sarah's work with Dr. Morris expanded her horizons in unexpected ways. They developed a routine. First, Sarah would describe a plant remedy she remembered from her time in the wild or had learned about from native knowledge shared at Fort Sullivan. Dr. Morris would then consult his medical texts to identify known properties of the plant and note any scientific validation of the traditional uses. Their collaboration proved fruitful. Sarah's recollection of a specific fern used by wolves to clean wounds, she had observed them rolling in crushed fern beds after injuries, led Dr. Morris to investigate its properties. Laboratory analysis revealed antimicrobial compounds that supported its traditional use. Their findings were eventually published in a small medical journal, with Sarah listed as a contributing observer. This professional recognition, modest though it was, provided Sarah with something she had been lacking: a bridge between her past and her future. The wolf child and the emerging scholar were no longer separate identities, but connected aspects of a cohesive self. By the spring of 1880, Sarah had developed a new routine that balanced traditional education with her specialized interests. Mornings were dedicated to conventional studies with her tutor, mathematics, literature, history. Afternoons alternated between assisting Dr. Morris and accompanying Elizabeth on social and charitable engagements. Evenings were for correspondence, letters to Thompson and Martha, to Lieutenant Brooks, who occasionally sent her news of developments in Montana Territory, and increasingly to educational institutions seeking information about opportunities for women in scientific fields. On a bright April afternoon, as Sarah sat in Dr. Morris's office carefully sketching the structure of a plant specimen, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up, expecting a patient, and instead found herself staring at a familiar weathered face framed by graying hair. "Mr. Thompson!" she exclaimed, dropping her pencil and rushing forward. Ezekiel Thompson stood in the doorway, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his clean frontier clothes, clearly new and purchased for the journey east. His face broke into a broad smile as Sarah approached, though he hesitated, clearly uncertain about the appropriate greeting for the girl who had once been his wild charge. Sarah had no such hesitation. She threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug that bridged the 4 years since their parting at Fort Sullivan. "Look at you," Thompson said when she stepped back, his voice gruff with emotion. "Wouldn't hardly recognize you except for those eyes. Still got the wolf in them, I see." It was true. Despite her transformation in every other respect, her neat braided hair, her proper dress, her articulate speech, Sarah's green eyes retained that unusual alertness, that capacity to see beyond the surface that the wolves had taught her. "What are you doing in Harrisburg?" Sarah asked, leading him to a chair. "Your letters never mentioned a visit." "Wasn't planned," Thompson admitted. "But I had business in Philadelphia, and it seemed wrong to be this close and not see how you were faring." Dr. Morris, who had been observing from his desk, rose and introduced himself. "Mr. Thompson, I've heard so much about you from Sarah. Your care for her during that transition period was remarkable." Thompson shrugged off the praise. "Did what anyone would have. She did the hard part herself." The physician, sensing their need for private conversation, excused himself to check on a patient in an adjacent room, leaving Sarah and Thompson alone. "You're looking well," Thompson observed. "Your aunt is treating you right?" "Aunt Elizabeth has been wonderful," Sarah confirmed. "Patient and understanding even when I struggled to adapt. And she's supported my interest in medicine." She gestured to her desk with its books and specimens. "I'm learning to combine what I observed in the wild with scientific principles." Thompson nodded approvingly. "Always knew you had a special way of seeing things. Glad you found a use for it." Sarah studied her old friend carefully, noting new lines in his face, a slight stiffness in his movements that hadn't been present 4 years earlier. "And you? Your letters sometimes leave out details. Are you well?" "Well enough for a man my age," Thompson hedged. "The winters get harder. I won't deny it. Been thinking it might be time to find less demanding work than trapping." Something in his tone alerted Sarah to the true purpose of his visit. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked perceptively. "You're considering a change." Thompson smiled ruefully at her insight. "Can't hide much from those wolf eyes of yours, can I?" "You're right. I've been offered a position as a guide for scientific expeditions through the university in Philadelphia. Better pay than trapping, easier on the joints, and they value my knowledge of the territories." "That's wonderful news," Sarah said sincerely. "You'd be an excellent guide." "There's more to it," Thompson admitted. "The position would be based in Philadelphia most of the year. I'd only travel west during expedition seasons, means I'd be settled in the east." His eyes met hers meaningfully. Not far from Harrisburg, the implication was clear, and it touched Sarah deeply. After 4 years of separation, Thompson was considering a major life change that would allow him to be part of her world again, not As a guardian, she was too old for that now, but as a connection to the critical chapter of her life that had shaped her so profoundly. "I'd like that very much," she said simply. That evening, Thompson joined Sarah and Elizabeth for dinner at the Chestnut Street house. The conversation flowed easily as Thompson shared news of Martha Reynolds, who had married a widowed settler and moved to a homestead near Fort Sullivan, and of Lieutenant Brooks, now Captain Brooks, who continued to patrol the territories with distinction. Goody. After dinner, as Elizabeth prepared coffee in the kitchen, Thompson handed Sarah a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Nearly forgot." He said, "Bitch, they brought you something." Sarah unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small carved wooden box with a wolf pack depicted in relief on its lid. Opening it, she found a folded letter, and beneath it, a wolf tooth on a leather cord. "From Luna," Thompson explained as she lifted the necklace. "She passed last winter, natural causes," the scout said. "Lieutenant Brooks knew I'd want to know, and one of the Shoshone trackers who knew your story found her den. Thought you might want something to remember her by." Sarah cradled the tooth in her palm, memories washing over her, Luna's warm body pressed against hers on cold nights, the alpha female's patient instruction in hunting techniques, the final farewell in the mountain clearing 4 years earlier. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than I can express." "The letters from Timothy Cook," Thompson added, indicating the folded paper. "The boy who survived the Carson Reed massacre by hiding under a wagon. He's a man now, working as a clerk in Denver. Heard about you through Lieutenant Brooks and wanted to connect with the only other survivor." Sarah unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The idea of communicating with someone who had shared that pivotal tragedy, who remembered her family as they had been before violence destroyed their world, was overwhelming. She had spent years rebuilding her identity from fragments. Here was someone who had known her whole. As she scanned Timothy's careful handwriting, a passage caught her attention. "I remember your father's kindness to my family when our wagon broke an axle. I remember your mother sharing preserves with the children. And I remember you, Sarah Mitchell, always watching everything with those serious green eyes, collecting interesting stones and feathers. You were yourself even then, observant, thoughtful, connected to the natural world around you." The words unlocked something in Sarah, a recognition that the essence of who she was had remained constant despite the extraordinary disruption of her life path. The child collecting stones before the massacre, the feral girl running with wolves, and the young woman now pursuing medical knowledge were not separate selves, but a continuous, evolving identity forged in both tragedy and resilience. Looking up, she found Thompson watching her with understanding. "He remembers them," she said softly. "My family, and me before." "Thought that might be important to you," Thompson replied, "knowing that there's someone else who carries those memories." Sarah carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the wooden box, along with the wolf-tooth necklace. This small container now held physical connections to both chapters of her interrupted childhood. The human family destroyed by violence, and the wolf family that had preserved her life afterward. "I've been trying to reconcile them," she admitted. "The girl I was before the massacre, the wolf child, and who I'm becoming now. Sometimes they feel so separate, like different lives lived by different people." Thompson considered this thoughtfully. "Makes sense you'd feel that way. Most folks don't have their lives divided up so clearly by before and after. But from where I stand, I see the same person all the way through, adaptable, observant, brave. The circumstances changed, but not the core of you." It was a perspective Sarah needed, an outside view from someone who had witnessed her journey across its most challenging transition. If Thompson could see continuity where she had perceived fracture, perhaps it existed. "Will you tell me something truthfully?" she asked. "Always have." Do you think I made the right choice? Coming east, rejoining human society fully? Thompson didn't answer immediately, giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. I think you made the only choice that would let you become your full self, he said finally. The wolves gave you gifts, keen senses, understanding of the natural world, survival skills most humans have forgotten. But they couldn't give you language, knowledge, the chance to use that remarkable mind of yours to its potential. He gestured to the books lining Elizabeth's parlor shelves, to Sarah's journal filled with medicinal plant information, to the letter from Timothy Cook. This is the path that lets you integrate all parts of your experience. The wolf will always be with you in how you move, how you observe, how you think, but now you can give voice to those insights in ways that might benefit others. His words articulated what Sarah had been gradually discovering through her work with Dr. Morris, that her unique perspective, informed by both human knowledge and wild wisdom, had value precisely because it bridged worlds that were rarely connected. As the evening drew to a close, plans were made for Thompson's return visit once he was settled in Philadelphia. Sarah walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him leave, even with the promise of more frequent contact in the future. "I've missed you," she admitted. "Your understanding of all of it." Thompson smiled, the weathered lines of his face softening. "You're doing just fine, Sarah Mitchell, better than fine. Wherever your path leads next, medicine, science, whatever calls to you, you'll bring something to it that no one else can. That's a rare gift." After he departed, Sarah returned to her bedroom and opened her window, letting the spring air flow in. The stars were partially visible tonight, more so than usual above the city's haze. Somewhere far to the west, under those same stars, the descendants of Luna's pack would be hunting in the Montana wilderness, following ancient patterns of survival. Sarah touched the wooden box containing Luna's tooth and Timothy's letter. Tangible connections to the dual heritage that had shaped her. For the first time, she felt not divided between worlds, but enriched by both. The wolf child and the scientist were not competing identities, but complementary aspects of a unique whole. The path ahead would hold challenges. The limitations society placed on women's educational and professional opportunities, the complexity of explaining her background as she moved further into the adult world, the ongoing process of integrating her extraordinary experiences into a cohesive sense of self. But Sarah Mitchell faced these prospects with the adaptability learned in the wilderness and the knowledge gained in civilization. Whatever came next, she would meet it with both the wolf's resilience and the human's capacity for growth, a survivor twice over, uniquely equipped to forge her own way. Philadelphia, 1885, the lecture hall at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania buzzed with anticipation. The spring symposium on frontier medicine had drawn an unprecedented audience, filling every seat and leaving attendees standing along the walls. At 18, Sarah Mitchell was the youngest presenter on the program, a fact that had raised eyebrows among the established medical community. "Quite a turnout," observed Dr. Catherine Morris, daughter of Sarah's mentor and now a colleague in her own right. "They're curious about you." Sarah adjusted the slides for her presentation on indigenous plant remedies, her movements efficient and precise. "About my research, I hope. Not just my history." Though Sarah rarely discussed her unusual childhood, publicly, rumors had circulated since her admission to the college 2 years earlier. The story had evolved in the telling, from a simplified account of wilderness survival to increasingly fantastical versions involving wolf packs and feral behavior. Sarah neither confirmed nor denied these stories, maintaining a dignified silence that only intensified curiosity. "Dr. Bennett is here," Catherine whispered, nodding toward a silver-haired man in the third row. head of therapeutics at Penn Medical. He criticized your article on pain management using willow bark derivatives. Sarah nodded calmly. I read his rebuttal. Perhaps today's evidence will address his concerns. The confidence in her voice wasn't merely for show. The past 6 years had transformed Sarah from a recovering wolf child into a poised young scientist whose unique background informed rather than hindered her professional development. Under Dr. Morris's mentorship, she had published 3 articles on wilderness medicine before even entering formal medical training. Her application to the Women's Medical College had been accepted despite her unconventional early education, based largely on these publications and enthusiastic recommendations. As she took her place at the podium, Sarah surveyed the audience with those remarkable green eyes that still carried the alertness of her wolf days. In the back row sat Ezekiel Thompson, now employed as the University of Pennsylvania's premier expedition guide, and beside him her Aunt Elizabeth, whose steady support had never wavered. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, her voice clear and measured. Today I will present findings from 3 years of systematic research into analgesic compounds found in native plant species of the Northern Territories, with particular attention to their applications in emergency medicine, where conventional treatments are unavailable. For the next 30 minutes, she outlined research that bridged worlds, scientific analysis of traditional remedies, methodical documentation of folk treatments she had observed during her time at Fort Sullivan, and correlations with modern medical understanding. The presentation was remarkable not for the speaker's unusual history, but for the rigor of her methodology and the practical implications of her findings. When she opened the floor to questions, Dr. Bennett rose first. Miss Mitchell, your research presents interesting correlations between folk remedies and established medical treatments. However, I'm curious about your methods for assessing efficacy in the field, particularly given the subjective nature of pain relief. The question was pointed but fair. Sarah met it directly. We utilized 3 assessment protocols, Dr. Bennett. First, patient self-reporting using a standardized scale. Second, observable physical markers including pulse rate, perspiration, and pupil dilation. Third, time to functional recovery, specifically how quickly the patient resumed normal activities. She paused. Additionally, we had a unique opportunity to observe animal self-medication behaviors, which first directed our attention to several of these plant species. This last comment elicited murmurs from the audience. Dr. Bennett leaned forward with evident interest. Animal self-medication. Could you elaborate? For a moment, Sarah hesitated. This was the crossroads she frequently encountered. How much of her personal experience to incorporate into her professional presentation? Meeting Thompson's encouraging gaze from the back row, she made her decision. My earliest observations of medicinal plants came from watching wolves treat their own injuries, she stated simply. Wolves with open wounds will seek specific plants, particularly Artemisia species and certain fungi with antimicrobial properties, rolling in them to create poultices. Similarly, wolves suffering from internal parasites consume specific plants with known anthelmintic properties. The revelation created a stir. Dr. Bennett's skeptical expression shifted to one of genuine curiosity. And you had the opportunity to observe these behaviors. How exactly? Sarah took a deep breath. For years, she had compartmentalized her life. The academic Sarah Mitchell separate from the wolf child of Montana Territory. Perhaps it was time for integration. Some of you may have heard rumors about my background, she acknowledged. Following the deaths of my family when I was 6 years old, I survived for nearly 4 years in the wilderness of Montana Territory in the company of a wolf pack. During this time, I observed numerous instances of animal self-medication that later informed my scientific inquiry. The hall fell silent. Sarah continued with composure. While my circumstances were unusual, my observations were real. When I returned to human society, I began documenting these observations systematically under the guidance of my mentor, Dr. James Morris. The research I've presented today represents the scientific validation of knowledge first glimpsed through those experiences and subsequently tested using rigorous medical protocols. Her candor transformed the atmosphere in the room. What might have been dismissed as sensation instead became a compelling illustration of how different forms of knowledge, observational, traditional, and scientific, could complement each other. When approached with methodological rigor, the questions that followed focused increasingly on the substance of her research rather than its unusual origins. By the session's end, even Dr. Bennett approached to discuss potential collaboration on a broader study of natural analgesics. As the hall emptied, Thompson made his way to the podium, his weathered face creased in a proud smile. "You did it," he said simply. "Bridged the worlds at last." Sarah smiled, gathering her notes. "It felt right. The wolf child and the scientist aren't separate people anymore." "They never were," Thompson affirmed. "Just took time to see how they fit together." Later that evening, as they dined at Elizabeth's rented rooms near the college, Thompson presented Sarah with a newspaper clipping. "Thought you might be interested. They're establishing a new national park in Montana, not far from where Luna's. PAC had their territory, looking for scientists to conduct a wildlife survey this summer." Sarah's eyes brightened with interest. "A chance to go back?" "Not to stay," Thompson clarified, understanding her immediately, "but to visit, to study, to bring your medical training and scientific methods to the place where it all began." The possibility resonated deeply. In the years since leaving Montana, Sarah had constructed a new life built on education and scientific inquiry, yet the wilderness remained present in her dreams, in her unusually acute senses, in her intuitive understanding of natural systems that complemented her academic knowledge. "A perfect integration," Elizabeth observed, understanding the significance of this potential journey, your past and your future meeting on purpose. That night, standing at her window overlooking Philadelphia's gas-lit streets, Sarah Mitchell held Luna's tooth in her palm, the talisman she had carried through years of education and evolution. The city sprawled before her, offering opportunities for research and advancement that the frontier never could. Yet the distant wilderness called to a part of her that textbooks and laboratories couldn't satisfy. Perhaps this was her unique gift, to move between worlds, to translate the wisdom of one into the language of the other. The summer research expedition would be just the beginning. There would be other opportunities to bring scientific inquiry to wilderness knowledge, to honor both the wolves who had saved her life and the humans who had helped her reclaim her place in society. Sarah Mitchell, survivor, scientist, bridge between worlds, smiled as she envisioned the path ahead, no longer divided but whole, Montana Territory, summer 1885. The expedition team made camp at the edge of a sprawling valley, their canvas tents small intrusions against the vastness of the Montana wilderness. Sunset painted the western sky in blazing oranges and purples, silhouetting the distant mountain range that Sarah Mitchell knew intimately, though she hadn't seen it in 9 years. "Recognize anything?" asked Professor Lawrence Hargrove, the University of Pennsylvania botanist leading the scientific survey of the newly designated federal lands. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on a distinctive rock formation jutting from a hillside 2 miles distant. "The wolves called that Eagle Stone," she said, then caught herself with a small smile. "That is, it marked the eastern boundary of their hunting territory. I used to watch golden eagles nest there in spring." Hargrove had grown accustomed to these moments when Sarah's scientific vocabulary gave way to more personal recollections. Unlike some of their colleagues who still regarded the wolf girl scientist with skepticism, he found her dual perspective invaluable to their research. "We'll survey that area tomorrow," he noted, making an entry in his field journal. "The microclimates created by those rock formations often harbor unique plant species." Sarah unpacked her own specialized equipment, collection vials for plant samples, a portable microscope, notebooks filled with systematic observations of flora and fauna. At 21, she had grown into a striking young woman whose movement and bearing still carried subtle echoes of her unusual childhood. Her academic credentials had silenced most critics, but it was her unmatched ability to read the landscape that had secured her place on this prestigious expedition. Ezekiel Thompson approached from the perimeter of the camp where he'd been consulting with the Shoshone guides. Though officially retired from full-time expedition work, he had insisted on accompanying Sarah on this journey back to the territory where he had found her a decade earlier. "Dinner's almost ready," he informed her, then lowered his voice. "The guides say there's a wolf pack denning about 3 miles north. Not Luna's descendants, they've moved farther into the high country since the hunting increased, but wolves, nonetheless." Sarah nodded, absorbing this information with the complex emotions that characterized her relationship with this landscape. "I'd like to observe them if possible. Their behavior might provide context for some of the plant uses we're documenting." "Thought you might say that," Thompson replied with a knowing smile. "I've arranged for us to set up a blind tomorrow at dawn. The guides know a good vantage point near their hunting grounds." That night, as the expedition team gathered around the campfire to discuss the next day's research objectives, Sarah found herself increasingly distracted by the familiar sounds and scents of the Montana wilderness. The subtle shift of wind through pine needles, the distant cry of a hunting owl, the earthy perfume of sage crushed underfoot. Sensory experiences that triggered memories her body had retained even when her conscious mind had been occupied with medical texts and laboratory protocols. Professor Hargrove noticed her distraction. "Are you all right, Dr. Mitchell?" he asked quietly, using the title she had earned through her specialized research position at the college, though she had not yet completed her full medical degree. "Yes," she assured him. "Just remembering. This landscape speaks a language I haven't heard in many years." Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. Since the expedition began 3 weeks earlier, he had observed Sarah's gradual transformation, not a regression to her feral state, as some colleagues had nervously predicted, but rather an integration of her analytical mind with the intuitive awareness she had developed during her years with the wolves. "Perhaps you should share some of those insights with the team," he suggested. "Your unique perspective on the ecological relationships here could inform our research approach." Sarah considered this invitation. In the years since her presentation at the medical symposium, she had become more comfortable incorporating her personal history into her scientific work when relevant. The initial sensation had faded. Colleagues now valued her specialized knowledge more than they gossiped about its origins. She stood and addressed the assembled researchers, botanists, zoologists, geologists, and cartographers from 3 different universities, all here to document the natural resources of the territory before settlement irreversibly changed the landscape. "As some of you know, my connection to this region is deeply personal," she began. "From ages 6 to 10, I lived among a wolf pack in these mountains after losing my family to violence. While my experience was unusual, it provided insights into this ecosystem that might benefit our research." She proceeded to outline observations about seasonal patterns, plant-animal interactions, and territorial behaviors that conventional scientific expeditions, with their brief visits and external perspectives, often missed. She described how wolves selected certain clay deposits to combat intestinal parasites, how they utilized specific fungi found on decaying logs to treat pore infections, how they harvested and consumed particular berries primarily after the first frost, As she spoke, the scientist began taking notes, asking questions that bridged Sarah's experiential knowledge and their specialized fields. What had begun as an awkward acknowledgement of her unusual background transformed into a collaborative scientific discussion that enriched their collective understanding. Later, as the camp settled for the night, Thompson found Sarah sitting alone at the edge of the clearing, gazing at stars that seemed impossibly bright compared to Philadelphia's skies. "You found your balance," he observed, lowering himself beside her. Age had stiffened his joints, but his eyes remained keen. "Wasn't sure you ever would when I first found you running with wolves. Wasn't sure you'd find a place in either world." Sarah smiled at her oldest friend, the man who had bridged her transition between worlds and had never stopped believing in her capacity to integrate them. "I'm still finding it," she admitted, "but yes, it's getting clearer. I belong to both worlds, and perhaps that's the point. Someone needs to translate between them." Before dawn the next morning, Sarah and Thompson set out with 2 Shoshone guides toward the location where the wolf pack had been spotted. They traveled silently through the half-light, moving with the kind of woodcraft that both Europeans had learned from native teachers, Thompson during his years as an army scout, and Sarah through her wilderness apprenticeship with Luna's pack. The blind was expertly positioned, a natural depression behind a fallen log, enhanced with carefully arranged brush that concealed the humans while providing visibility of a game trail and meadow beyond. As the sun edged above the eastern ridges, Sarah prepared her scientific tools, journal, pencils, small brass telescope, alongside ancient ones, absolute stillness, careful scent management, patient observation. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the morning mist began to lift from the valley floor, shadows detached themselves from the tree line. 5 adult wolves and 3 nearly grown pups moving with purposeful grace along the game trail. The alpha female led, a silver-gray wolf with intelligent eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. Sarah watched through her telescope, making rapid notes about physical condition, behavior patterns, and social interactions. But beneath her, scientific observation ran a deeper current of recognition, not of these specific animals, but of their essence, their way of being that had once been hers. "Different pack structure than Luna's," she whispered to Thompson. "See how the beta male flanks rather than follows, and the yearlings have more independence. Suggests different prey patterns, possibly adapted to the increased human presence in the region." Thompson nodded, impressed as always by the depth of her perception. Where others might see merely wolves, Sarah recognized complex social dynamics and evolutionary adaptations. For nearly 2 hours, they observed the pack as it patrolled its territory, marked boundaries, and eventually disappeared back into the dense forest. When they were certain the wolves had moved on, Sarah and Thompson emerged from the blind to examine the areas where the animals had shown particular interest. "Look at this," Sarah called, kneeling beside a disturbed patch of soil where one wolf had paused extensively. She carefully extracted several partially chewed plant roots from the churned earth. Osha root, used traditionally for respiratory infections. One of the younger wolves appeared to be breathing with slight labor. "She's self-medicating." She collected samples methodically, documenting the location and context of each finding. What once had been unconscious knowledge absorbed through observation of her wolf family had evolved into rigorous scientific methodology, yet the foundation remained the same keen awareness of natural patterns. When they returned to camp, Sarah immediately set to work examining her samples under the portable microscope, comparing her findings with botanical references and her own extensive notes. Professor Hargrove joined her, fascinated by the connections she was drawing between wolf behavior and ethnobotanical practices documented among indigenous tribes. The parallels are remarkable, he noted as Sarah showed him her observations. Native knowledge and animal behavior converging on the same medicinal applications, developed through entirely different evolutionary pathways. Not entirely different, Sarah corrected thoughtfully. Both emerge from intimate, sustained interaction with a specific landscape over generations. Both represent knowledge embedded in direct experience rather than abstract theory. Hargrove considered this perspective. Most of my colleagues would prioritize scientific verification above traditional knowledge or animal behavior. And they'd miss valuable insights in doing so, Sarah replied without hesitation. My research approach integrates all three. I observe traditional and animal applications, then apply scientific methods to understand the mechanisms and validate the effectiveness. Each knowledge system has its strengths and limitations. This integrated approach had become Sarah's trademark in the scientific community, controversial to some traditionalists, but increasingly respected as her research yielded practical applications. Her work on wilderness medicine had already influenced emergency protocols for military medics and frontier physicians, saving lives through treatments derived from her unique synthesis of knowledge. As the expedition continued through the summer, Sarah's role evolved beyond her official capacity as botanical researcher. She became a cultural translator, helping her scientific colleagues understand the landscape through multiple lenses: academic, indigenous, and what she had come to call the wolf perspective, a way of reading terrain through movement patterns, sensory information, and relational awareness. When they reached the high valley, where Luna's pack had once denned, Sarah experienced a profound sense of homecoming. Though she had no intention of remaining, her life's path had clearly taken her elsewhere. This place would always represent a critical chapter in her formation. I'd like to go alone from here, she told Thompson one morning, indicating a familiar ridge where she had often watched the sunset during her years with the wolves. Just for a little while. Thompson understood. Take all the time you need. I'll tell the others you're conducting specialized observations. The climb was easier than when she had made it as a child, though the ridge seemed smaller than in her memories. Sarah reached the summit and settled on a sun-warmed boulder, gazing across the valley that had been her sanctuary during those years of profound transition. From the small leather pouch she wore around her neck, she extracted Luna's tooth, her talisman through years of education and professional development. She had carried it from Fort Sullivan to Harrisburg to Philadelphia, and now back to its origin point, completing a circle that few humans ever had the opportunity to travel. As she sat in contemplation, a sound reached her, distant but distinct. A wolf's howl echoed across the valley, followed by another, then a chorus. Not Luna's pack long dispersed or deceased, but their descendants perhaps, still holding this territory against the encroachment of human settlement. Without conscious thought, Sarah found herself responding, her voice lifting in a howl that emerged from some deep place memory had preserved intact. The sound was neither entirely human nor entirely wolf, but something unique that bridged worlds just as Sarah herself did. The answering howls confirmed the wolves had heard her. Whether they recognized something familiar in her call was impossible to know, but in that moment of communication across species boundaries, Sarah felt the completion of a cycle that had begun with tragedy and evolved into something profound and purposeful. When she returned to camp that evening, Thompson noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a centered quality, as if some final piece had fallen into place. "Found what you needed up there?" he asked as they sat by the fire, the expedition team engaged in animated discussion nearby. "I think so," Sarah replied. "For years I've been working to integrate my experiences, to be both the wolf child and the scientist without internal division. Today, I realized there never really was a division to overcome. Each part of my journey prepared me for the next." She looked toward their colleagues, respected academics who now sought her insights and valued her unique perspective. The massacre taught me that life can change in an instant, forcing adaptation. The wolves taught me to observe and interpret landscapes with all my senses. Returning to human society taught me to translate between different ways of knowing. Each step was necessary for the work I do now. Thompson nodded, understanding the significance of this integration. What happens when we return east? Will you continue your medical studies? Yes, but with a clearer focus now. I've been offered a research position studying indigenous medicine across different tribal traditions, correlating practices with scientific understanding of plant compounds. It's work that needs someone who can move between worlds, she smiled. Someone like me. On their final night in the territory, the expedition team celebrated their successful survey. They had documented hundreds of plant species, mapped critical watersheds, and recorded wildlife populations that would inform conservation policies for the newly protected lands. Sarah's contributions had been invaluable, bringing dimensions to their understanding that conventional scientific training alone could not provide. As the others shared stories around the campfire, Sarah found herself composing a letter in her mind to Aunt Elizabeth, who had remained in Philadelphia due to her advancing age. How could she explain what this journey had meant? How returning to the site of both her greatest trauma and her most unusual salvation had completed something essential in her formation? Perhaps understanding wasn't necessary, only acceptance of the extraordinary path that had led a 6-year-old massacre survivor through life with wolves to become a pioneering researcher bridging disparate knowledge systems. Elizabeth had always seen the continuity in Sarah's journey, even when Sarah herself had struggled to reconcile its seemingly contradictory chapters. The next morning, as they broke camp for the return journey east, Sarah took a final moment alone at the edge of the wilderness that had shaped her. In her pack were carefully preserved specimens, meticulous notes, and scientific observations that would contribute to both academic knowledge and practical applications in medicine, ecology, and conservation. But in her heart, she carried something equally valuable: the complete integration of her extraordinary life experiences into a cohesive whole. She was Sarah Mitchell, survivor of the Carson Reed Massacre, former wolf child of the Montana wilderness, and now pioneering scientist creating bridges between different ways of understanding the natural world. As she turned toward her waiting colleagues and the journey back to civilization, Sarah carried with her not just Luna's tooth and scientific specimens, but the living legacy of her unique path, a legacy that would continue to unfold through her research, her teaching, and her lifelong work as a translator between worlds. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.